Hello, everyone. I'm Kaylee Isaacs, founder of the Awake Network, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the official opening of the Compassion in Therapy training series on compassion-based approaches for working with shame. This is co-produced by the Center for Mindful Self-Compassion and the Awake Network. It's really inspiring to see such a large group of mental health professionals coming together from all over the world. And so as you're signing on now, I encourage you to just take a moment to say hello in the chat, whether you're joining on YouTube or Zoom. Just let us know where you're tuning in from, what you're looking forward to from this event, so we can get a sense of who's all here together. And today, we're delighted to begin with this live opening keynote with Kristen Neff and Chris Germer, exploring self-compassion and shame in therapy. Before we get going, I wanted to briefly share the schedule for this session. We'll be going for 90 minutes total and closing at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time. We're going to start from hearing from Kristen and Chris around self-compassion, and then from there, we'll be moving into a focus on shame and the clinical applications of self-compassion in therapy. And we'll close today by taking a Q&A from those of you joining us live. And you'll be able to join in on that, whether you're on YouTube or Zoom. So we'll have more instructions on that soon. And again, just thank you so much to everyone for being here and bringing your wisdom and presence to this gathering. Before I pass it off, I have the delight of introducing Kristen Neff and Chris Germer. Chris is a clinical psychologist and lecturer at the Harvard Medical School, and has truly been at the forefront of bringing mindfulness, self-compassion, and compassion into psychotherapy. It's his insightful and passionate work on shame and self-compassion specifically that was really the spark that inspired this particular gathering and the focus on shame. Kristen is currently an associate professor of developmental psychology at the University of Texas at Austin, and she's a pioneer in the field of self-compassion research, conducting the first empirical studies on self-compassion nearly 20 years ago today. She's been recognized as one of the most influential researchers in psychology worldwide. They're both good friends and collaborators, and together have created the wildly successful Mindful Self-Compassion program and co-founded the Center for Mindful Self-Compassion. On a personal note, it's been a real pleasure working with both of them and the entire team at CMSC, the Center for Mindful Self-Compassion, to create this training as well as the previous years. And thank you both so much for being here to start off this event. I'll pass it off to you first, Chris.
Thanks, Kaylee. Thanks so much to you and your team at the Awake Network, who've worked so hard to make this summit happen. As you said, shame is my favorite topic, and I'm especially pleased to be sharing this opening presentation with Kristen Neff, my dear friend and colleague. But most of all, thank you all from all over the world for your interest in this topic, compassion-based approaches to working with shame, and also for your time. Time is precious. Thank you so much. So now I'd like to turn it over to Kristen.
Yes, thank you, Chris. I too am really happy to be here. Awake Network does just such amazing gatherings. And I'm also very happy that we're talking about shame, and also especially how self-compassion can be used for shame, because it's really just so key to unlocking mental health and well-being and healing. So let me tell you a little bit about how I got into the field of self-compassion research. So first of all, the idea of self-compassion came from when I first learned mindfulness meditation, actually. So there's a link between mindfulness and self-compassion. Believe it or not, it was my last year of graduate school, and I was personally feeling a lot of shame. I had gotten a divorce and things ended in a really messy way, and I was just feeling badly about myself. And so I thought I learned mindfulness meditation because I thought it might help me. And I was also feeling stressed at the time. And the very first night I went, so for those of you who are interested, it was taught in the tradition of a Zen teacher named Thich Nhat Hanh, a great mindfulness teacher. And he always talked about the importance of having compassion for yourself as well as others. And so the very first night I started to learn mindfulness meditation, I also started to practice self-compassion. The teacher had said, just try to be intentionally warm and accepting and kind to yourself, like you would be to a good friend. And I tried it. I went home that night, I remember, and I said things like, Kristen, divorce happens to everyone. Everyone makes mistakes. It's okay. I still love you. And almost immediately when I started bringing that intentional warmth and friendliness to myself, I was more able to deal with all the difficult emotions I was experiencing. And then what happened is I got a job at University of Texas at Austin. And I decided I wanted to study self-compassion because although it had been talked about for years in various traditions, no one had actually measured it or conducted research on it. So I decided I wanted to create a scale to measure self-compassion. But the first step was to define precisely what is self-compassion. And so thinking about it, in terms of my model, by the way, other people define self-compassion a little bit differently, but I have a particular model of self-compassion. The first thing to know is that it's the way we are with suffering. Actually, in Latin, the word passion is to suffer, come means with. So it's how do we relate to suffering, whether that suffering is from things like shame or feeling badly about ourselves or feeling inadequate, or whether it's just something happens in our life, like a hurricane or some external circumstances. In other words, how are we with ourselves when we're feeling a lot of negative emotions? And I realized that actually the first step of self-compassion is mindfulness. Right? So again, they're linked. It's not a mistake that I learned about it in a mindfulness meditation course. Because what mindfulness is the ability to be aware of what's happening as it's arising, right? To turn toward things even when they're difficult. And when difficult emotions, arise, usually the last thing in the world we want to be is with them. We want to get rid of them or hide our head from them or pretend they aren't there. So we need to be able to be with our negative emotions or suffering or feelings of shame or inadequacy or pain in order for us to give ourselves compassion. So that's actually the first step of self-compassion is mindfulness. And then once we're able to kind of be with those tough emotions, with compassion, we're actually with ourselves with a particular quality, and that quality is kindness, warmth, support, encouragement. Now, often, unfortunately, the way people are with difficulty is they just blame themselves for it. It's my fault, or something I did, or something's wrong with me. And so with self-compassion, the idea is we're just like we would be with a friend. Hey, you're trying the best you can. How can I help? I'm here for you. So it's a friendly, benevolent attitude. And then really important, and by the way, I didn't realize this at first. I started writing my first paper on self-compassion, and it was just going to be mindfulness and kindness. And then this question stuck with me. What's the difference between compassion and pity, or between self-compassion and self-pity? And I realized really key to compassion is a sense of connectedness with other people. Right. So if you pity someone, you look down on them. If you have compassion for them, you say, hey, I've been there. And so with self-pity, we feel alone. Poor me, woe is me. We feel very isolated. With self-compassion, we remember that, hey, difficulties or imperfection, this is part of the shared human experience. No one is perfect. Yeah, the way we suffer is different. Certainly the amount that we suffer is different. But the fact that we suffer is actually what makes us card-carrying members of the human race. And so I realized that for it to be self-compassion, we need to have a sense of connectedness with others. Remember that, first of all, we aren't alone. Even though, especially when we've made a mistake or feel badly about ourselves, it feels like people living a normal life are those who are leading a perfect life. And it's just me who's failed or is inadequate in this way. So with self-compassion, we turn that around and we remember, again, this is what connects us with others, not what isolates us from others. And Chris, do you want to talk a little bit specifically about how this relates to shame?
Yeah. So I think what's really cool about Kristen's model is that the opposite of these three components, the opposite of mindfulness, common humanity, and kindness are, in fact, key characteristics of shame. So the opposite of mindfulness is, in Kristen's model, over-identification, which in clinical terms could really be called rumination. In other words, why me? Why this happened to me? And when we're stuck in shame, we kind of turn in on ourselves. We become self-absorbed. We ruminate. And this is really the opposite of mindfulness, which is more about spaciousness and perspective taking. And the opposite of common humanity is isolation. So when we feel shame, shame makes us want to go small, go silent, and go away. It is the opposite of common humanity. We feel, uniquely alone in shame. And finally, the opposite of kindness is self-criticism, which you could call the language of shame or the voice of shame. And research shows that actually self-criticism is very closely related to just about all forms of pathology. But the research also shows that these three factors, self-criticism, isolation, and rumination, are pathogenic factors, in just about all psychopathology. So anyhow, the cool thing is that self-compassion is the opposite of shame, both theoretically, as well as in the research. In the research, self-compassion is associated with lower shame across diagnoses, and in therapy, as self-compassion increases, shame usually decreases. So it's the perfect antidote to shame.
Yeah. And just in terms of a research example, if you have someone think about a past event that they feel shame about, and you have them write about that event with a paragraph of mindfulness, kind of being aware, paying attention to what's happening in a more spacious way, remind themselves that they aren't alone, these things happen to everyone, and some words of kindness, in real time in the lab setting, you can see that shame decreases. So we really do have a lot of empirical evidence that it is the antidote to shame, or at least one of the antidotes to shame. I also want to talk a little bit about more recent work I've done about the two main expressions of self-compassion, which I like to call tender self-compassion and fierce self-compassion. And both are really key. So tender self-compassion is the accepting aspect of self-compassion. This is what allows us to be with ourselves, kind of accept ourselves, and also be with our negative emotions in an accepting way so that we aren't fighting them and resisting them. And this is really the healing energy of self-compassion, the nurturing aspect of self-compassion. It has more of a kind of a soft, gentle feel, and it allows us to really hold ourselves and hold our pain and hold our feelings of difficulty, just like maybe a parent might hold a newborn child. Then after a while, that newborn child feels supported and starts to calm down. So it's a very key aspect of self-compassion. But it's not the only way that self-compassion works, because, actually in the field of psychology, compassion isn't defined as an emotion, it's defined as a motivation. And in particular, the motivation to alleviate suffering. And so sometimes to alleviate suffering, we have to do something, we need to take action. And this is what I like to call the fierce aspect of self-compassion. So for instance, a very important part of self-compassion is protecting ourselves, drawing boundaries, saying no if someone's harming us in some way, drawing a line in the sand, or speaking up against some sort of injustice. Another way this manifests is actually taking active steps to provide for ourselves, asking ourselves, what do I need to be happy? Then actually spending some time, energy, and resources to, again, make ourselves happy, to fulfill ourselves. And then finally, really important is motivating change, because if we're engaged in behaviors that are harmful, or we're in a situation that's harmful, it's not compassionate to accept those. The compassionate thing to do is try to change them. And it's like yin and yang, they need to be balanced, right? If we're too accepting and aren't fierce enough, we may be complacent. But if we're too much about action and change and don't accept ourselves, well, then we're just always striving, we're on this treadmill, we're never going to be good enough. So when they're balanced and integrated, that's really a compassionate state of mind.
Yeah, so tender self-compassion, it does make a ton of sense when we're beating up on ourselves, how to reassure ourselves, validate ourselves, comfort ourselves, soothe ourselves. But and so fierce self-compassion is usually associated with the outer world, action in the outer world. But what's interesting is that fierce self-compassion is also helpful with the inner world. In other words, we can say no, a firm no or not now to a harm that's coming from the inside. We can say no to self-criticism. So a good metaphor for this, which my colleague Cassandra Groff shared with me, is that it's like a mom who could be fed up with a child's misbehavior. Maybe the child is doing something that's not good for the child, not good for the family, not good for the parents, not good for anyone. So at some point, the parent says no. And the same way, we can have the same relationship with the inner criticism. When we hear it long enough and we see its impact, at some point inside we say, and that's fierce inner compassion, fierce self-compassion. Thank you.
By the way, sometimes I like to call this mama bear self-compassion, right? It doesn't matter gender identity, whether you're non-binary, male, female identified, or whether you're a parent. Like mama bear energy is just this energy that I think all humans have access to, which rises up in the protective form of fierce self-compassion. So what we know about self-compassion in terms of, are most people self-compassionate? Actually, we find that most people aren't very self-compassionate. Most people are a lot more compassionate than others than they are to themselves. And there are a few reasons for this. One we know from the research is that there are a lot of blocks to self-compassion, a lot of things that get in the way, especially when that compassion is turned inward. And one of these are cultural misgivings. I mean, if you think about it, I know we have people on this call from all over the world, but in most cultures, we're raised to be compassionate to others. And the idea of self-compassion, we're kind of like, I don't know if that's such a good idea. That sounds a little dangerous. And this is because we have some misconceptions about what self-compassion is that serve as blocks. So one misconception is that it's selfish, right? That if we have self-compassion, that somehow it automatically means we aren't being compassionate to others. As if, we only have 5 units of compassion. So if I give 3 to myself, I'm only going to have 2 left over. And what the research shows very clearly is it doesn't work that way. It's additive. So in other words, the more compassion that flows inward, the more compassion, the more resources we have available to flow outward. So for instance, that's one of the reasons why self-compassion is negatively linked to burnout. Because if you give and have compassion to others and you treat yourself coldly, you're going to run dry very quickly. But if you fill up your tank, so to speak, with compassion, you can sustain giving to others. Another misgiving is that it's weak, right? I think that's because we don't understand fierce self-compassion. We just think it's this tender, soft, gentle energy. But again, self-compassion, what we know from the research, makes us strong, whether it's dealing with something like divorce or a natural disaster or cancer, or there's actually a lot of work with combat soldiers. We know that combat soldiers who can be self-compassionate about the trauma they faced are less likely to develop post-traumatic stress syndrome. They're more able to function in their daily lives. They're less likely to, for instance, turn to alcohol as a way to deal with their pain. So self-compassion makes us strong. Having our own support, having our own back, being an ally makes us stronger than cutting ourselves down. So that's a misconception. Another misunderstanding is that it's all about like giving yourself a break, just giving yourself pleasure. In other words, self-indulgence. Well, self-indulgence means giving yourself short-term pleasure at the expense of long-term harm. And if you care about yourself, you aren't going to choose just what feels good. You're going to choose to do things that are difficult for your long-term health and well-being. And again, the research shows that people exercise more, they eat better, they go to the doctor, etc. So it's not self-indulgence. But actually what we find in the research is the number one block, cultural block to self-compassion anyway, is the belief that it's going to undermine our motivation. We really think that we need to be hard on ourselves, like really punish ourselves in order to get anything done, or else we'll be lazy. The research is very clear. It's the opposite. And in fact, what it shows is that self-compassion is a more effective motivator than self-criticism, primarily because when we fail, instead of saying, I am a failure, or, being worried that if we try and we fail, then, we're going to be horrible people, which creates anxiety. It actually allows us to accept, okay, failure is a part of the human condition. What can I learn from this mistake? And so what we know is that self-compassion actually increases motivation and also performance, because it creates the safety to learn and grow. Chris, do you want to talk about shame and blocks? Yeah.
Yeah. So actually, all these misgivings. So, for example, self-compassion will make me selfish or self-indulgent or weak or undermine my motivation. Are really related or anchored in shame. In other words, what's wrong with being weak? What's wrong with being selfish? It's because people won't like me so much, So June Tanguay, who is really probably the most senior shame researcher there is and pioneer in this field, will be giving a talk in this summit. And as you'll hear from her, shame is a negative self-evaluation. In other words, I am imagining in my mind what you are imagining in your mind, and it's not good. It's a self-conscious emotion with global negative evaluation. And so our misgivings are often related to shame because we think it's going to make people not like us so much. Yeah. So one way of cutting through the misgivings is to activate self-compassion, which helps to decrease shame.
Unfortunately, just to say, there are some other blocks that are perhaps more deeply rooted, and it doesn't mean they can't be overcome. But one of the reasons probably that people are more compassionate to others and more self-critical with themselves is evolutionary biology, right? So what we know is that when we are personally threatened, right, when we're afraid of something, we tend to go into threat defense mode. In other words, we go into fight, flight, or freeze mode. And so let's say if I make a mistake, I feel personally threatened. If my friend makes a mistake, I'm not so threatened. So the threat level is different. And so, but if I make a mistake where I feel like I'm being self-indulgent, I go into fight, flight, or freeze mode. But of course, the threat is me. The problem, the danger is me, because there's something wrong with me. And so we turn the fight, flight, or freeze mode inward, and we fight ourselves with self-criticism, thinking that either it'll make me safe because I'll control myself and won't make mistakes, or maybe like I'll beat others to the punch. So, I'll hurt myself first so it won't hurt so badly when other people criticize me. That's one thing that happens. Or we flee into a sense of isolation and shame, which Chris will talk about. We kind of really separate ourselves mentally from the others, which is an evolutionary safety behavior when we feel threatened, or else we freeze and we get stuck. On the other hand, with other people, again, if your friend makes a mistake or someone you care about, we're more likely to use the care response, which is also part of evolutionary biology, right? So we are born as caring human beings, but primarily we evolved to care for infants and group members, because when we do so, our genes pass on to future generations. So what we're doing with self-compassion is not entirely natural, at least from an evolutionary sense, in that we have to kind of do a hack, and we use the care system, which evolved for others, with ourselves. It can be done, but the physiology is slightly different.
And it's also helpful to think about shame also in terms of its evolutionary roots. Our hunter-gatherer ancestors needed to stay connected in order to survive. And shame was a signal when we were displeasing the tribe, because it was an important signal, because individuals couldn't survive without the tribe, and the tribe couldn't survive without the individuals. So shame, as particularly acts of contrition, like blushing or gaze aversion or slump shoulders, they actually helped us to avoid punishment when we broke the rules. And the terrible feeling of shame also made us want to reconnect with our group. And also, since shame is so unpleasant, human beings have really learned quickly what to do in order to avoid getting shamed. Now, what's interesting also, though, is that it's actually not breaking the rules that causes shame quite so much as being devalued by the group. David Sinzer came up with, did some research which showed this. But this is particularly pernicious because often we're being devalued for no reason. We didn't break any rules. We're perfectly fine people, but maybe our identities are marginalized or oppressed by culture. And therefore we feel shame for no reason, right? Some people feel shame for no reason. Other people, should feel shame and they don't, right? So anyhow, it's important to connect shame to the evolutionary roots, and also that it's mostly about social devaluation, even more than breaking the rules.
Right. Right. So there are cultural reasons, there are evolutionary reasons why it can be difficult to be self-compassionate. And of course, it's not going to be a surprise to anyone on this call that there are also reasons associated with our early family history. So the research on this is pretty clear that people as adults who have difficulty with self-compassion, maybe they're afraid of it or they have a very hard time giving themselves compassion, is often linked to early family history. So one thing is attachment security, right? So people who are securely attached, meaning their parents consistently gave them love and kind of met their needs, they tend to feel more worthy of self-compassion. So as an adult, they meet their own needs in a compassionate way. And people whose parents, they had insecure attachment, maybe their parents were inconsistent or negligent or negative toward them in some way, they tend to feel that their needs aren't worthy of being met consistently. And then it can be harder to have self-compassion as an adult. Similarly, parents who are very harshly critical, people tend to internalize that criticism as an adult, and that can lead to lower self-compassion. But the people who really struggle the most with self-compassion are those whose parents who have an early trauma history, who are abused in some way by caregivers or family members. Because in that case, again, if you think about evolutionary processes, our family, our early parents are supposed to make us feel safe, and it activates the feelings of care associated with the care system. And when our parents are abusive or threatening, then the signals get mixed between the care system and the threat system. So that actually giving yourself compassion, if you have an early trauma history, can actually feel very scary. And so you might say this is the bad news in terms of it's more difficult. The good news is the research is also very clear that good therapy, people working with it in a skillful way, which I'm sure Chris will talk about, can actually help people develop secure attachment as an adult and heal from the wounds of early family trauma.
Yeah, I think an important point to know is that no one was born with shame, with trait shame. No one was born with a burden of shame that we carry around with us all the time. We're all born with the capacity for shame for the evolutionary reason that I described. But when we internalize critical messages from childhood and culture, as Kristen was saying, that's what leads to trait shame, right? When everywhere we go, we feel we're prone to feeling shame. But the important message here is that trait shame is not our fault. It is the result of how we were treated in childhood or by our culture, or ways that we continue to be treated and devalued by patterns of discrimination and oppression in our culture. And so we have two wonderful speakers in this conference, Sydney Spears and Camila Mahade, who are going to be talking with us about these cultural impact of oppression and discrimination that leads to shame. Yeah. So Kristen, do you think I should move on to the applications?
Yeah, we're going to talk about clinical applications. And just to let you know, I won't be saying much because I'm a research psychologist. I'm an honorary therapist, but not a therapist by training. So I'll let the expert take over this part. But then it will be leading a practice afterwards. So
Yeah. Expert is a scary
you are, own it.
adjective. I would say I'm a student I'm practicing, right? The practice is the word. Anyhow, what I'd like to do now is to start by giving everybody a sense of a compassion-based approach to shame. And this approach can guide psychotherapy, and it can also guide our personal practice. So usually, what's the difference? Usually therapy focuses on healing old wounds, and personal practice focuses on building resources, like the resources of mindfulness and self-compassion. And the mindful self-compassion program that Kristen and I developed, which is now really a project of the worldwide community of teachers, this program was designed for the general public. So we like to say that MSC is not therapy, but it's therapeutic. But very recently, Kristen and I were talking with Esther Perel, the couples therapist, and when I said this, she protested. She said, "It is definitely therapy. It's just not traditional therapy." So I know that Esther Perel is right, because as we grow in self-compassion, our old wounds naturally reveal themselves. And just like children coming out of hiding, they are healed when they receive the compassion that they always needed and wanted. And also, the brilliant Martha Sweezy is going to be giving a talk on this very topic, particularly in shame in relationship to internal family systems. Anyhow, recently, some colleagues and I developed a specialized 8-week training, Self-Compassion for Shame. And during the pilot of this training, the question was raised, how do I know that I'm making progress in self-compassion for shame? And so the best answer that we could come up with was, how at home do you feel in your own skin? Just being yourself. Or how much of your humanity can you genuinely accept and allow? So to give you a sense of the potential of the self-compassion approach to shame, and also to share some of the themes that arise during the self-compassion for shame process, I'd like to share with you a practice, a guided reflection called radical homecoming. Okay, so if you feel up to a reflective practice right now, please find a comfortable position in your chair or lying down. And then gently close your eyes or leave them partially open, directing a soft gaze in front of you. And as I read the following words, please let them wash over you and through you, from the neck down, as it were, in your body, without any need to think too much about the content of each sentence. No, the heart can usually accept what the mind cannot. So, welcome home. Welcome home to this moment, the only moment of time we really have. Welcome home to your body and no other body, without which you would not be here today. Welcome home to the parts of your body, all of which are trying their best to promote your wishes and your aspirations. Welcome home to your emotions, both pleasant and unpleasant, all of which are trying to teach you something that you need to know. Welcome home to the emotion of shame, the most difficult human emotion, which is a pure expression of the human wish to be loved. Welcome home to your wish to be loved, the invisible thread that makes sure you stay connected even when everything else falls apart. Welcome home to your vulnerability, which is an essential truth of human experience, even when it scares us. Welcome home to woundedness, personal and cultural, across time and space, the invisible substrate upon which every human life unfolds. Well, let's just pause here for a moment, perhaps anchoring your awareness in the sensations of your feet on the floor, or your chair supporting your body. Giving yourself permission to engage this little reflection as much or as little as you like, as feels comfortable. Maybe even allowing yourself to bathe a bit in compassion, offering yourself an inner smile. Okay, and now also welcome home to your fierceness, to the strong arm that protects you from harm, and when necessary, demands equality and justice. Welcome home to forgiveness and mercy, the ultimate medicine for human ignorance and human frailty. Always available when we're ready to forgive. Welcome home to self-forgiveness and self-mercy, because the misdeeds of others have taken residence within us since birth. Welcome home to your many identities, including those that have been overlooked and devalued by others. They are all precious and worthy of celebration. Welcome home to your hidden identities and your hidden parts, who yearn to be loved and to be set free. Welcome home to your journey to freedom and to this particular moment in your journey, as unfinished as it is. Welcome to your yearning to be free, to the ache of feeling unfinished, of being incomplete. And welcome home to compassion, the power that surrounds us all and has the capacity to transform all that hurts and all that we are. And now let's all take a few long, soft breaths. And then when it feels right, to slowly open your eyes. So this radical homecoming hopefully captures the invitation of mindfulness, which is loving awareness and acceptance of our moment-to-moment experience, and also captures self-compassion, which is loving awareness of the experience and acceptance of the experiencer, and really all aspects of the experiencer, especially those that are burdened by shame that is hidden or hurting. So the foundation of this approach is actually connecting with the universal wish to be loved. So human beings are social animals, and we all need to belong in order to survive. And to thrive, we need to be appreciated, we need to be valued, we need to be respected, which all comes down, in my mind anyway, and perhaps in yours, which all comes down to being loved. You know, since birth, we have needed to be loved in order to thrive. And even in this very moment, all of us still wish to be loved. Of course, as Daniel Ladinsky wrote, we don't say this out loud because someone will call the cops. But the wish to be loved is the motivation behind shame. If we didn't wish to be loved, we wouldn't care what other people think about us, and we wouldn't feel shame. So, but we will never get rid of shame, because as human beings, we will always wish to be loved. It's part of our DNA. However, we can do something better. We can still be fully human, which means that we can still feel shame, but we can be free from the grip of shame. In other words, we can have a new relationship to shame. So connecting with the wish to be loved actually starts a new relationship with shame. The wish to be loved is an innocent wish, and compassion flows easily when we perceive innocence, like the way we perceive children or pets. You know, we feel naturally compassionate toward them. And in the midst of shame, most of us feel unworthy of kindness or compassion, but when we get underneath shame, into the motivation behind shame, the energy behind shame, perhaps with the insight that just as all beings wish to be loved, so do I wish to be loved, with this insight, then the shame story, what we say to ourselves, you know, I suck, I'm bad, it starts to lose its grip. So most importantly, accepting that we all wish to be loved actually opens the door to giving ourselves the love and compassion that we need. And also to accepting love and compassion from others, you know. So there are many obstacles to self-compassion. Kristen mentioned quite a number of them, but we're actually less bothered by them. We don't worry about them so much when we feel entitled to love and compassion, as we did, if you can remember, when we were born, before we were told otherwise, before we were told we did not deserve love and compassion, before shame, right? So talking about the wish to be loved can often make people feel uneasy. You know, some folks find words like the wish to belong or the wish to connect easier to swallow. And this may be because the idea that we all wish to be loved can also make us feel vulnerable, you know, like a young child. And we feel vulnerable because when we say something like, I just want to be loved, we inevitably start to reflect on all the times in our lives when we were not loved. It shines a light on the opposite, all right? So for those of you who are familiar with mindful self-compassion, this is actually what we call backdraft. Backdraft is the distress that arises when we give ourselves compassion. But not to worry, backdraft is actually a good thing because it's the mechanism by which self-compassion heals. So emotional disconnections, which can go way back to the earliest months of our lives, disconnections which are times when we were not loved, when we were not seen, when we were not felt. These emotional connections are really at the root of shame. And they occurred in childhood. And as I said, they continue to occur in our cultures. But one by one, with the background knowing that we wish to be loved, one by one, as we meet these disconnections and these hurts and these wounds with compassion and mindfulness, we can heal. So by practicing self-compassion, we can even reparent ourselves and develop a sense of inner safety or a secure base, perhaps even for the first time in our lives. So then the question arises, what does self-compassion for shame look like in therapy? So from a compassion-based perspective, there are actually 3 steps: mindfulness, compassion, and working with backdraft. So mindfulness means recognizing shame when it arises, like, this is shame. Name it and you tame it, right? Shame is actually an emotion of denial. Mostly it works invisibly and in the shadows. And knowing when we feel shame, while we're feeling shame, gets the whole ball rolling. Okay? So part 2 is compassion, which really means responding to the experience of shame in the moment with kindness and compassion. And we can really do this at 3 levels: compassionate presence, compassionate relationship, and compassionate interventions. So a therapist's compassionate presence has a subtle effect on the client. You know, research has shown that human beings actually synchronize with each other when they're in each other's presence. We synchronize our movements, we synchronize our physiology, we even synchronize our brain waves, and we have mirror neurons. So we feel each other. And this is how a therapist's presence or a therapist's compassion gets internalized. And Sherry Geller is going to be talking about this subject in this summit when she talks about therapeutic presence. But then there's also the compassionate relationship. The best way to teach self-compassion is to be compassionate. Okay, so when we have compassionate conversations with our clients, echoes of these conversations change how our clients talk to themselves. And so Gabor Mate will be speaking about this with his really wonderful compassionate inquiry method, also in this summit. And finally, there are interventions, which are practices that clients can do for themselves between sessions. And Kristen will be leading one of these in about 5 minutes. And in the Self-Compassion for Shame course, we have 13 different ways to respond to shame with compassion to transform the experience of shame. And then the third part, as I mentioned, is identifying backdraft. So we need to know when shame-based thoughts arise, like I'm bad, I'm defective. We need to be able to identify emotions associated with shame, such as rage or fear, despair. Body sensations associated with shame, like muscle aches and pains, body memories, or shame behaviors like aggression, withdrawal, subordination. And when we see these things, then responding to this backdraft with compassion at the 3 levels that I just described. So before I close, I'd like to share with you a clinical vignette, okay? Which kind of illustrates some of these points. Consider a male client, Leon. His name is Leon, who seemed to be angry all the time. He alienated most of his work colleagues, and he also lost his wife over this issue of anger. However, most of the time in therapy, Leon just, wanted me to validate his anger rather than really help him to manage it in a better way. So after some months, it occurred to me that anger might not be Leon's problem after all. Maybe there was something invisible that was making this anger stick. Maybe Leon's problem was really shame. So in that case, anger would be the secondary emotion. It would be a defense against shame. And I suspected that actually being angry or even enraged at people, even risking losing their friendship, was for Leon actually a relief because it temporarily spared him the feeling of being assaulted by his inner critic, who was calling him a useless sack of shit and all kinds of other terrible things whenever he made a mistake. So I noticed, for example, that when Leon lost an account at work, he spoke about betrayal by his customer rather than talking about his sense of failure or shame. So was shame behind the anger? So people often feel ashamed for feeling shame. And Leon was very sensitive to shortcoming, to any shortcoming. So I never mentioned the S word. Instead, Leon and I started talking about how painful it is when people turn away from us, as so many people had done in his life. And we started to normalize the pain of abandonment, even starting with my own admission that I too feel enormous pain when I feel rejected, because I, like all human beings, want to be appreciated and respected and maybe even loved most of the time. And that's part of being human. And Leon kind of got this a little because he could see that in his daughter. So eventually we got to exploring where Leon learned to be so angry. So anger was his father's go-to response when anything went wrong on the poor rural farm where Leon grew up. And Leon, he could see his father's desperation, especially as a single dad. But most importantly, Leon felt that it was he started to feel anyway, that it was really unfair that his father blamed Leon for the father's misfortunes. And he could gradually admit that he felt like a huge burden on his father and in his life, especially after his mother died. And that, for Leon, was the burden of shame that Leon carried into adulthood. And when Leon started to be able to say no to the messages that he heard as a child, he also began to be able to say no to the internalized messages. And then he became somewhat less reactive when his self-worth was challenged as an adult. And Leon also learned to take better care of himself. He had a childhood friend whom he felt really understood him, this guy, and he had been through a lot together. And toward this person, Leon had a lot of loyalty and compassion in abundance. And so we use this relationship as a model for a compassionate relationship that Leon could have with himself. Leon knew how to be compassionate. He just couldn't do it for himself. He could do it for his daughter, he could do it for his friend, but he couldn't do it for himself. And then gradually, over a few years, Leon's shame and anger subsided. So in this clinical vignette, becoming mindfully aware of shame was the first step, starting with my own suspicion that shame might lie behind Leon's anger. And then rather than shaming Leon for having shame, we explored the motivation behind shame, his wish to be respected and appreciated. And with that insight, Leon's past wounds began to heal themselves. And as an adult, he could see that how he was treated as a child was wrong. In other words, fierce compassion arose within him for himself as a young child, like Kristen was saying. That mama bear aspect arose within him, protecting the child that was not protected at the time. And then tender compassion arose, which is starting to treat himself as he would a good friend. So although anger and shame were only occasionally a part of the conversation, the focus of therapy was Leon's unmet need to be valued and supported, and making up for it by learning to be more compassionate in a tender and in a fierce way with himself. So I think I'll stop there. And so now Kristen would like to lead us in a self-compassion practice that can be integrated into psychotherapy or into one's personal practice when shame arises in our lives. Kristen?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I always, believe it or not, love to hear you talk about shame because it makes it, again, instead of this, boogie man, it's like this thing that we can really approach, which is just so helpful. So I'm going to be leading a practice called the self-compassion break for shame. So some of you may have heard of a self-compassion break before. It's actually where we intentionally bring in the 3 components of self-compassion, so mindfulness, a sense of common humanity, and kindness, to some instance of suffering or emotional pain. And so in this case, we're going to be doing it for shame. Just to be clear, I know most of you know this, but just to clarify the difference between shame and guilt, right? So guilt is when you feel badly about something you've done. It's about a behavior or an action. Shame is about feeling badly about yourself. Guilt actually can be helpful. There's some research that shows that self-compassion is positively linked to feeling badly about a behavior and wanting to repair it. But it's negatively linked to, again, feeling badly about yourself as a person. And there are different levels of shame. There can be intense shame, really pathological shame. Or if you think about it, the opposite, and embarrassment is kind of like a light form of shame. When we feel badly about ourselves, we feel self-focused. Maybe we don't feel like we're horrible people, but we just feel very uncomfortable. But the biggest thing is to understand is shame is a self-focused emotion. It has to do with how we feel about ourselves in terms of our worth. And that's really what we're going to be focusing on in this practice. But a little more toward the lighter end, more embarrassment or light shame, not the heavy duty stuff, because as Chris kind of mentioned, when we feel intense shame, we can't think. Our brain kind of shuts down, we go away. And it's very hard to learn or practice when we aren't even present because we're overwhelmed with shame. So we're going to be working with something that's a little lighter, more like embarrassment or a little bit shame, feelings of shame. But having said that, sometimes you think you choose something that's not heavy shame, not strong shame. And then whew, it comes up and you realize like a deck of cards, like underneath there's a whole lifetime of shame. If this happens to you, please stop the practice right now, just because I don't want you to get into overwhelm. We want to just really focus on the techniques. So if at any point in this exercise you start to become overwhelmed, just open your eyes and start maybe listening to the instructions in a more objective way. But if you can do it for yourself, you'll actually get more out of it. Okay. So if you feel like you're ready to turn toward something that's somewhat shameful, please close your eyes and let's take a few breaths, find your body. Feel your body in the room, feel your feet on the floor if you can, or maybe the weight of your body in your chair. And just notice I'm here right now. Take a few breaths. Well, keep breathing, but focus on a few breaths. And I'd like you to think of something, it can be something from the past, or maybe even something happening currently. Some feeling or situation in which you felt or feel embarrassed, like really self-conscious, like I can't believe I did that. Or maybe even a little bit of shame. For instance, maybe you were overreactive, right? And you were angrier than you intended to be. And afterward, you felt like, oh, I can't believe I was so angry. I feel badly about myself for doing that. Or maybe you said something to someone that was culturally insensitive. You didn't mean to, but the person was really offended, perhaps. You know, maybe you were writing a friend some kind of gossip, like, I can't believe that she or he or that person said that. And you accidentally CC'd the person you were talking about, right? So you're kind of caught out gossiping, you know, maybe some, if you're all getting older, maybe some bodily fluid appeared unintentionally or something like that, right? So something that's embarrassing or shameful, but again, not too intense. So please take a moment to really choose wisely what feels right to work with right now. Okay. So just kind of, again, play the situation out in your mind. And then we want to bring mindfulness toward the feeling you have of a shame or embarrassment. Right? So if it's more embarrassment, you might just say, this is how embarrassment feels. Or if it's actual shame, a little heavier, this is how shame feels. Because we're just labeling it. Right? And then please drop your awareness inside your body and just see if you notice how the shame or embarrassment feels in your body. What are the actual physical sensations of it? Right? There might be coldness, or it could be heat. It could be like intense stabbing. It might be numbness. How is it expressing for you in your body? Also, where are you feeling it in your body? Okay, so just see if you can allow these physical sensations to be here. I know they're uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable to experience this by definition. But see if you can use mindfulness just to allow some space for you to feel the physical sensations of the embarrassment or shame. And if it feels safe, perhaps allowing yourself to also get in tune with what is it that you are afraid that other people think of you or would think of you if they knew what happened, right? That makes you feel badly about yourself, right? Something like that. It means that you're stupid or worthless. You're just so messed up. Something fundamentally wrong with you. Right. And of course, remembering these are not facts. These are just beliefs triggered by the experience of shame or embarrassment. But these beliefs are part of the experience of shame. So we want to just become mindfully aware of, again, the physical sensations, and also mindfully aware of any beliefs that are driving them, beliefs of somehow that something's wrong with you. Again, not facts, they're just thoughts. And as you're thinking of the situation and getting in touch with the shame or embarrassment, you're probably feeling isolated and alone. Right? You're probably feeling cut off or separate from others. That's kind of the nature of shame. But just taking a moment to remember the truth of the fact that, first of all, every single person on this Zoom meeting is feeling something similar, right? And that everyone feels shame and embarrassment. You are certainly not alone. This, in fact, is part of being human. Right? Most people in your situation would feel something similar. Many people have been in your situation and felt something similar. Right? But that everyone has things happen that make them feel ashamed or embarrassed. This is actually what connects us to others. It's not what separates us from others. It's what connects us to others. Right? And that's because, as Chris said, what makes us human is this natural wish to belong, to be appreciated, to be valued, respected, and loved. Right? So you're feeling the human need to be loved and respected is taking right now the form of shame or embarrassment. And everyone here on this call is feeling something very similar. So let's see if we can bring some kindness to ourselves, because it's painful for all of us to feel shame. It hurts. Right? And so maybe we can express some physical kindness. Perhaps if you can, if you know where you feel the shame, you can put your hand on the spot in your body where you feel it. if it's more just a general sense of unease, you can try your hands on your heart or some other place. Just putting your hands on your body and feeling the warmth of your hands. Touching yourself in a supportive way, as if you're kind of literally holding yourself, your body, your shame with your hands. And now bringing to mind some living being that you have a really easy, compassionate relationship with. Maybe a child or a pet, a friend or some loved one. Someone that you easily feel compassion for and you know they care about you as well. And just imagine this being, imagine the look in their eyes as they look at you with kindness and compassion. Allow yourself to just really bathe in that compassionate gaze. And often our pets are the easiest, your cat or your dog. But anyone you feel cares. And then considering for a moment, what words of kindness or support or acceptance would you most like to hear in this moment as you kind of are in touch with these feelings of shame or embarrassment? Maybe something like, I accept you just as you are. Or, I won't abandon you. I'm here for you. It's okay to make mistakes. I care. You're a good person despite being imperfect like we all are. Or maybe even I love you. And just imagine what words would really resonate with you most. And then see if you can actually just repeat these words to yourself, perhaps imagining that the compassionate part of yourself is talking to the part of you that feels this shame or inadequacy or embarrassment. Right, so just repeating these words, support and validation. Right, they may land, they may not, they may feel fake or phony. Just let your experience be as it is. Again, we're just really practicing the intention to be kinder to ourselves, taking it step by step. And when you're ready, you can open your eyes. Okay, so that's the self-compassion break for shame. Sometimes I think of it as the ingredients for baking a self-compassion cookie. So 1 part mindfulness, 1 part common humanity, and 1 or maybe 2 or 3, depending on how sweet you like your cookie, kindness. Okay. So I think we have about 15 minutes now for some Q&A, and I think Kaylee is going to lead this, or at least moderate this portion.
Thank you so much, Kristen. And thank you, Chris. Thank you both. I feel so much appreciation for everything that you shared during this first half. And I can see that in the chat as well, just overflowing gratitude for what both of you are sharing today. So we're going to go into some Q&A from people that are watching live. And so if you have a question for Chris or Kristen or both, go ahead and put it into the chat feature wherever you're tuning in from. And we're also hoping to take a question or two live with video and audio. So if you're interested in doing that, you're going to have to be on Zoom if you'd like to ask one live. And we ask that you ask those questions in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, which is different than the chat. And go ahead and put live at the beginning of your question so that we know that you'd like to come on with your audio and video. And if you're selected, you'll be hearing my name in a few minutes. So just be ready to come on live in case we call for you. So I see lots of gratitude coming in now for the practice we just did and also for the earlier practice. So yeah, if there's any questions about the practices or in general, go ahead and type them in now. And I'm going to take a look to see what we have here. The team's helping to gather a few questions for me too. So I have one here from Hubert. If someone struggles with shame, do you recommend having some traditional therapeutic work with them before engaging in practices like this?
Chris, I'll let you take that one.
Well, it depends how resourced the person is, yeah, and also how much shame they have, how deeply the shame goes. But what's important to remember is that everything that we do is in a social context. And so mostly we want to first create a sense of safety. You know, the physiology of safety is the foundation of compassion. If we feel frightened, as Kristen was alluding to, we can't experience self-compassion, and we're just going, it won't work. So it's really helpful to teach within a safe interpersonal context, and sometimes the best way to help people with shame is in the relationship itself, you know, just by being, you know, remember compassionate presence with somebody in a kind way. Sometimes it's conversation and sometimes it's practices. So we want to resource our people in advance, either relationally or through self-compassion practice before we touch shame. Kristen, any other thoughts?
No, I mean, I think that's, you know, here's the thing, there's so many different ways to approach self-compassion practice. I think there really are no hard and fast rules. It really just depends on the situation. So, yeah.
Thank you. We have sort of a practical question. There was just so much appreciation for both of the practices that were shared. And there's been a lot of different questions coming in about how to access those, if there's scripts available. And so I guess there's sort of multiple questions in that. One, I'll just say that this recording is going to be up with translations and closed captions available for the next 48 hours. And we'll also have this full recording as well as transcripts as a part of the training package that's available for this series. So maybe we could put a link for that in the chat so folks can have that handy. And then also wanted to just ask, in that question, is this something that people could be bringing into their practices? Do you have guidelines around that, or how would you like to instruct folks with that?
Well, I'll just say that in general, we're happy for you to use anything. And that, you know, Chris and I, we want people to teach the practice of self-compassion. And the reason we don't have these, let's say, for instance, up on our websites is, you know, we don't want just anyone working with shame. That backdraft is a real phenomenon. I know a few people I saw in the chat, like, what do you do if you teach this and someone just can't handle it? That's why you want to be careful. Know about backdraft before you try to teach someone a practice like this. But you're all therapists, so you hopefully know how to do that. Chris, do you want to add something to this, or?
Yeah, so there were two different practices. Each one probably has different instructions around it. The self-compassion for shame, the self-compassion break for shame practice that Kristen led is really heavily emphasizes the resource of self-compassion. So it really is a resource, a resource building or a self-compassion building practice. So if when working with that practice, you can really work with anybody with that practice as long as they choose workable shame situation to work with. If you choose something that goes way deep and is going to cause you to be overwhelmed or dissociate, that's like really a wrong way to do it. So you should know that the self-compassion break for shame that Kristen led is really resource-based, but choose wisely the situation you will be bringing to it, because it's really important to, for any self-compassion practices, we want the energy or the attitude or we want self-compassion to predominate. Ultimately, what we're doing is teaching compassion. And so if you find that the wound predominates, you're actually not learning anything. So there's that. The other practice, which was the radical homecoming practice, is really more of a reflection. And I think that people could really use that in most situations, but again, use good judgment if some aspect of that particular practice is particularly triggering for a person you might be using it with, then just skip it. Again, we want we're practicing, cultivating, and evoking the experience of compassion because we want to develop a compassion habit.
Thank you. And I know there's a lot of practices on the Center for Mindful Self-Compassion website as well. So maybe we could send the link for that in the chat, and we'll put these under the video for folks who are watching later as well. But if you got something from those practices, I would recommend checking out the site for others as well. So we're going to take our first live question. Maya, we're going to be calling you on now. So if you see a request to unmute or to enable your audio, please select yes. And you can come on and ask your question. Looks like Maya is joining us now. And Maya, if you can hear us, it looks like you're muted. So you just need to enable your audio and video if you'd like.
Hello. Thank you for taking my question, and just thank you, Christian, and everyone for the space. It's been so inspiring and so healing. And throughout this talk, I've been thinking a lot about the relationship between spirituality and self-compassion and the parallels and just how they complement each other. And I was thinking about an article that I read a few days ago that talked about two aspects of self-transcendent experiences that I think are so relevant to both shame and self-compassion. And the first was self-annihilation. So the sense of not being as preoccupied with the sense of self and how the self is being perceived, which is kind of the core of shame. And then the other piece was self-connection. So the sense of being really deeply connected to a larger presence. And it was interesting because that self-transcendence was seen as underscoring a lot of different spiritual or mystical experiences. And from my own personal practice, I found that when I'm in a state that feels deeply spiritual, the compassion just oozes out. It comes in and it comes out in such an effortless way. And at the same time, or I guess in the same vein, sometimes I feel that when I'm struggling to resource myself and it's hard to connect with a friend or a dog and the loving presence of someone who's a source of comfort, thinking about a higher presence, whether it's nature or a specific deity like Kuan Yin or Kali, that can be really, really powerful. So I'm just curious if there's any research on that and what your thoughts are on how to integrate that from a practice perspective.
Well, maybe I'll just mention real briefly, then Chris has an answer I know as well. So first of all, the definition of self-compassion came from, I was studying Buddhism with Thich Nhat Hanh, and actually, instead of calling it common humanity, I wanted to call it interbeing, which is Thich Nhat Hanh's term for kind of oneness, that we're all part of a larger whole. I didn't use that term, because it's not very in common usage, but the beautiful thing about self-compassion is it can be taught in a very secular way. For some people, that language doesn't work. Just common humanity, your friends, other people is more inviting. But for people who think that way, like you or anyone really, absolutely, you can think of it as, you can use the word God, you can universal consciousness, beingness, everythingness, infinity, right? It is really pointing to that which is larger than ourselves. But in terms of research, pointing on what you were bringing up before, we know that self-compassion makes you less self-focused. So it actually, some people don't like the term self and self-compassion. You can call it non-self-compassion if you want, because actually when we include ourselves in the circle of compassion, as opposed to shaming and judging and criticizing ourselves, and remember our common humanity, we feel less self-focused. That's the opposite of pity. So absolutely, it reduces the sense of separate self. You want to add to that, Chris?
Yeah, perhaps. Love the question, Maya, and I also love Kristen's comments. And also I think it's really important to ask, what is the relationship of self-compassion to self-transcendence? So the way I look at it, Maya, is that self-compassion is the start. So I think there are actually 4 steps, you might say, on the path to liberation or freedom from suffering. The first is self-compassion. The second is self-confidence. The third is self-surrender. And the fourth is self-realization. So when we're really suffering, we first need to address the suffering, and that's self-compassion. But then what we know from the research is that self-confidence arises out of self-compassion. And when we feel confident, then we can actually begin to explore what actually will bring us the greatest freedom. And many people conclude, much as you just did, Maya, and also Kristen was just describing with common humanity, that actually softening the sense of self is the way to go, selflessness. So in other words, beginning to connect with the broader whole. So that would be then self-surrender, where we look beyond ourselves and begin to identify with a greater self. And then self-realization, I can't speak too much about that, but it comes sort of, you might say, by the grace of God, or, we put in the effort and then something new happens in which we discover something new, in which we are told is freedom from suffering. Self-compassion, self-confidence, self-surrender, and self-realization.
Thank you. Thank you so much for taking the question and providing those words of wisdom. It's given me a lot to think about.
Thank you, Maya. So it looks like we're coming just to the end of the time. I wonder if we might have one last closing question, or if it feels good to close here. Do you have a preference?
I can take another.
One more? Okay.
Yeah.
So we have a live question from Martina coming in. So Martina, please go ahead and enable your audio when asked, and you should be able to come on with us here in a moment. So we're bringing Martina on, and looks like she's here. And if you just go ahead and unmute, you'll be with us.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I want to say that thank you for the meditation, the exercise, and I found myself being able to be compassionate about a situation where I got angry. And at the same time, there was this other part in me that said, well, I don't really deserve it because, oh, sorry, I didn't start my video. I'll sure I'll get angry again. But so I was wondering how one, it's this, a bit of compassion was possible, but at the same time, I'm not deserving. And I was wondering how one can break that or.
Maybe I could just say, Martina, that we have different parts to us, you know. We have parts that are, you know, able to receive compassion. We have parts that cannot yet receive compassion. But compassion is like a muscle, and we build it, you know. And the stronger we are, basically the more compassion there is in the room. Those kind of parts of us that don't feel, you know, ready to receive compassion begin to feel ready to receive compassion when they trust that compassion is in the room. So you've already had a taste. That's a great thing. Continue to practice, and those other parts will yield. Yeah. Kristen, you have a
Well,
thought?
maybe I'll just add to that Chris and I, one of our favorite sayings, a Rob Nairn quote, which is the goal of practice is simply to become a compassionate mess. Right. So the goal isn't to stop getting overreactive with anger. You know, that still happens to me. We'll still make mistakes. We'll still be a mess. Our life will still be a mess because that's what it means to be human. So you don't want your compassion to be dependent upon getting things right, because you won't. And so actually it starts to change. Instead of focusing on getting things right, you start to focus on opening your heart. And in some ways that becomes more important, right? It's like instead of focusing on what's happening, your focus is, how am I relating to what's happening? And am I relating in an open-hearted, loving, compassionate way? And that actually starts after a while with practice, as Chris said, to become more important to you. So you will still be a mess. I will still be a mess. Chris will still be a mess. Every single person on this call will still be absolute messes. But can we open our heart to that and be compassionate? And if so, we've achieved our goal. It doesn't mean we don't still try. Of course, we do our best, but, you know, we're limited. We're flawed human beings. We just, you know, we do our best and we open our heart. But compassion, that's the amazing thing. It is possible at any moment. Believe it or not, it's available at any moment. And that's a beautiful, amazing truth from my point of view.
Thank you so much. That was very touching. Thank you very much to both of you.
Thank you so much, Martina. And thank you so much, Chris and Kristen, for sharing so generously with us today. And for everyone who's joining, I saw someone in the chat say that it's so touching to see everyone coming together to learn more about self-compassion and compassion. And I fully agree. So for folks who'd like to learn more about mindful self-compassion, again, I really encourage you to check out the Mindful Self-Compassion website. We'll chat that again into Zoom and make sure that the links are available under this video. You'll find just a ton of resources and a variety of programs there, whether you're new to self-compassion or have been doing this for a long time. There's the live online Mindful Self-Compassion course, which runs for 10 weeks, and there's openings for that this month, as well as specific courses on shame and for specific communities like healthcare providers and psychotherapists. And then for those who would like to earn CE credits for this session, as well as the full training, I encourage you to check out the continuing education training package, which we'll also chat the link for and include below this video. And we have a full lineup of sessions coming in a few hours from now this evening. So you'll receive another email from us then, and you can also just find anything that's available through the next few days on the event homepage. So we look forward to seeing you for the rest of this series. And thank you again so much, Chris and Kristen, for leading us today.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for organizing this Awake Network.
Take care, everyone.